Right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Bettina Moser. I'm a trauma-informed and an integrative life coach. So what that means is that I have moved over into a area where I'm doing more mind-body work. I specifically focus my interests in looking at the areas of trauma, and my coaching is more integrative in looking at how to heal on many levels in this regard. So I have a 20-year history in pelvic physiotherapy. I have taught undergraduate, postgrad, and I think what I realized is that in all of the time that I spent working and teaching and learning about the human body, I found myself in a situation where I didn't always have the skill sets to really deal with what was presented to me because of the nature of our wounds and our traumas and how that affects us both within the body. So we tend to think of trauma, and we're going to look at what the definitions of trauma is and how that presents itself, because most people would say to me, I don't have any trauma. And I would be the person that would tend to ask those questions. And I found myself in a situation where most people said they didn't have traumas, and where they did that, they had worked through that. They have been in a space of healing traumas over a period of their lives, if they were childhood traumas. And I found myself in a situation where when I worked with the body and trying to address the aspects that they presented with in my physiotherapy practice, I found that the emotional wounds would come forward again, and it presented me with some challenges because I was not really trained in this area. And although I worked in a multidisciplinary facility for many years, and I had a lot of support of psychiatrists and psychologists, I still found that ultimately, when we work with the human body, we cannot separate the two. So today's discussion, I would like to introduce you to a broader perspective of what trauma is, how it looks, how it presents, and really aid you in the understanding of really the biology of trauma, so how that really affects us on all levels. Because ultimately, whether you are trying to fix the body that's not working properly, or an anxiety or depression or an addiction, and all these types of things that originally in research stem from trauma, we have to get to the point of starting to understand what trauma looks like and start to recognize it. So when we're looking at trauma, the definition of trauma becomes very vague and skewed. So we think of trauma as something terrible that happened to us, okay? And often that's not the case. Very frequently, trauma is not what happened to us, but it's how we experienced whatever happened to us. And that is a subtle but profound nuance, because you can have a room full of people that experienced a bomb blast down the road, okay? And some people may be traumatized or experience wounding or ongoing effects from that, and other people won't. And this is the thing. So it's not really the bomb that went off down the road, but it's how I experience the bomb going off down the road that may or may not affect me. And it may affect me for 10 minutes. It may affect me for an hour. It may affect me for days. It can affect me for years, okay? And what happens is the longer that wounding or that unaddressed dysregulation of your nervous system, because that is what happens, we move into a reactive state, a protective state in our system. And the degree and the extent to which it dysregulates and our ability to re-regulate will depend on whether or not we experience something as traumatic or not. So the most important thing I think to take away is, first of all, that trauma is not what happened, but it's how it happened and how we experience that happening. So very frequently, it can be a very kind of non-event. But what happens is that there is a whole integration process that basically happens, that it doesn't serve us going forward in our lives, and ultimately causes a cascade of problems, both emotionally and physiologically. So really, if you can think of trauma, so the definition of trauma firstly limits us in our ability to acknowledge what is happening within us. So I found that very often when I have helped a person understand that a certain experience or belief or set of beliefs or reactions is trauma in the true definition, trauma-based, it's been very empowering, because then people say, oh, now I understand why I'm having those reactions. I understand why my body's doing certain things, and I understand why I haven't been able to heal. And then one can start to look at strategies that are more appropriate for what is actually happening. Okay, so if we had to look at trauma, and trauma is more appropriately in my understanding and experience of it, a wounding. Okay, and when and there is a doctor called Dr. Gabor Mate, and he describes it beautifully. He describes trauma as a wound. So in the initial phases, you will have a raw wound, you may have a bleeding wound, you may have the depth of it may vary, but it's an acute state. And really, that is a kind of more an emergency state. That is a first aid state. And depending on how that is dealt with, so if you have a wound, how are you cleaning it? How are you packing it? Are you bandaging it? How is that taken care of in the initial stages? So in the initial stages, you have a rawness, a sensitivity, a depending on the depth and urgency to care for it. And what happens, as with any kind of wound, it will start to heal, and the time in which it takes to heal will depend on the extent of the wound, the depth of the wound, the cleanliness of the wound, the way it was taken care of. And over time, it will start to move in, over a healing process that will be dependent on the nature of it. It can be a day or two, it can be weeks, it can be months, it can be years, okay? But what happens is that healing process starts to take place, but healing is generally done through scarring. So a scar forms, and again, the extent of the scar and the position of the scar and all of that will depend on how it heals. Does it get septic? Does it not? Depending on the rigidity, so scars are more rigid. They are not as flexible. So depending on where the wound is, if it is over a joint, for instance, you may not be able to move that joint easily unless you develop flexibility in it. So generally, our traumas are our woundings, really. And depending on how these woundings heal, do they scar? Do they not scar? How flexible is a scar? There will be a certain level of rigidity or inflexibility in the system. And that can be a literal system, so like your physical body, if there was physical harm, or in the emotional body, if there was an emotional aspect to it. And most people will think it's one or the other. Even in something that's only physical, there will be an emotional component. And in areas that look only emotional, there will always be a physical component, and I'll describe to you why. But what happens is that there will be, by the nature of that so-called scarring, there will be a inflexibility, whether that is in the physical body, and someone may come in and touch, they may come in too quickly into the body, they may give you a fright, and suddenly the system jerks in response to that. So all of that almost provides a space where there isn't enough movement that is happening to allow for normal functional life. Okay, in the more emotional spaces, there may be inflexibility in thought patterns, there may be inflexibility in belief systems, and ultimately years and years down the line, you have a situation where maybe you're trying to make a business decision, or you're trying to have a family, or you have children, and suddenly you're not coping well enough, or you don't know how to step over that. All those feelings of not being good enough come to the surface that could have come from something as small, in inverted commas, or a wounding of being told you were stupid as a child, or laughed at for giving the wrong answer at school, or something like that at very impressionable ages. And we don't generally see that as trauma, but it is a wounding. And in the broader definition of trauma, that ultimately encompasses all of that, and it provides these inflexible limitations, both mentally, emotionally, physically, that put us in a position where we cannot ultimately live to our highest potential. So what I find, by the nature of it, whether I'm dealing with a physiological, a body concern, or whether I'm dealing with an emotional, like an anxiety or a depression, or something that we think is only kind of here, ultimately it takes us back to our woundings or our traumas. So if we had to look at there's a lot of research that's been done in trauma in the more recent years, and defining how that looks and treatment approaches in that. But the one main thing that has come forward by certain professionals is what we call a polyvagal theory. I'm just going to share the graph with you. I have shared this previously in a previous talk around understanding the nervous system, but a lot of people are confused as to how can trauma be in the body, okay, if it's not necessarily a body trauma. So I understand if I'm in an accident and my leg gets broken in a few places, and if I touch that there will be a reaction. But what happens is there is a lot of confusion as to why, when we touch areas that have experienced trauma, why there's an emotional reaction, why there's suddenly flashbacks to that car accident, why. And you cannot heal the one without the other, because they almost run down the same line continuously. And I found a lot of the time that we would step back from the physical treatment to try and allow the integration of the emotional component to come into play. Or sometimes we'll be working on the emotional and the physical would play out, where people say, my leg's sore, and I've had these aches and pains suddenly since we've been chatting about this time period in my life, or whatever. And in our typical medical models, there is a separation between what's happening at the level of the mind and what's happening at the level of the body. And if we want to deal with the body, we go to a body person, a somatic therapist, a physio, a chiro, an OT. And if we're dealing with aspects of the mind, we move into this psychiatry or counseling or psychology aspect. But really, they are completely inseparable from a neurophysiological aspect. And really, any time we experience any form of wounding, and I'm just going to share this with you. So any time, and it is a graph that those of you that have joined various talks will recognize, but any time that we have an aspect of wounding, we go through this very primal physiological and neurophysiological. So basically, chemicals are released in the brain that go into our bloodstream and into our body, and they pattern the body in a certain way to allow a reactive and protective outcome, so that we can fight, we can run, we can freeze, we can appease in order to almost get through the situation. So the bottom green one is our parasympathetic, our calm nervous system, and this is our social engagement system. This is when we are relaxed, when we feel connected, when we feel safe. Okay, it's a time that we can have curiosity, groundedness, compassion, and really what's happening here, we're releasing oxytocin, which oxytocin is a bonding hormone. It's what's released when a mother's breastfeeding to bond with her baby. So ultimately, when we are feeling in the mind in a certain way, our body is reacting in a congruent way to what's happening at the level of the mind. So mind and body are coming together to have a almost united front in this. And this is a space where we rest, where we rejuvenate, where we sleep, where there's cell regeneration and healing. Our immune system goes up, our resiliency is built up. The minute we have a threat or a perceived threat, and this is the thing, a perceived threat is a wounding in and of itself, depending on the extent of the perceived threat. So someone that thinks that they may be raped in a situation will have a trauma response to that, whether or not there was bodily harm involved or not. The nature of the thought that outcome might be something that can play itself out will be traumatic. And again, the extent will be depending on the degree of the fear or the belief. Okay, so it doesn't have to actually have happened, but in those situations, the nervous system takes over the cognitive logical responses. It takes time for us to think and come up with something. This is reactive. There is no time when there's a lion that's about to eat you. There is no time to start thinking about what you're going to do. The system goes to the brainstem and it overrides. It makes the decision for you. And the system, depending on the extent of the threat, will decide, I'm going to fight or I'm going to run. And in that you have, sorry, and in that, you're going to have a different set of neurotransmitters. This is adrenaline, this is the cortisol. And with it will come a physiological reaction. Your heart rate will go up, your breathing will change, your muscles will tighten. There will be an actual body response to it, and there will be an emotional response to it. If there is a flight response, there'll be panic, fear, anxiety. If there is a fight response, there'll be anger, rage. So again, the two work together. They cannot almost be separated. If that trauma or threat or perceived threat is heightened, the system may decide to go into what we call freeze, which is a shutdown response, a dissociated response. And in that, you will again release a variety of different neurotransmitters. So this is what happens. And there is another response that is not on this chart, and it's called appeasing or fawning. So really in certain situations, like for instance, in childhood, if there is, or in an abusive marriage or relationship where there is a feeling of threat, the child maybe will start to appease and fawn and try to keep the, let's say, abusive alcoholic parent happy so that they are not threatened, or they're not going to be harmed. So in these reactions that happen, they cannot not happen because we wouldn't be alive. We have a combination of a emotional response and a physiological response. So that is what happens in the actual trauma or wounding moment, okay, where the wound is created. And from there, depending on how we tend to that wound in that initial space will depend on how that wound heals. And the thing that becomes important is that the healing will require both a mind and a body component to that. So if, for instance, the nature of the response was a fight response and a strong nervous system dysregulation, which is what is happening there. Ideally, it should happen in the moment, and then it should come down again, and you should come back into that green zone of relaxation and calmness and both mentally into peace and safety and connectedness, and physiologically into a space of regulation. And if that's not happening, that is when we can have long-standing playouts, really, where the woundings have long-standing effects. And these effects can be emotional and they can be physiological, but usually the one will be more dominant. So there may be a more emotional aspect, but there will always be a physiological one, because as your emotions are hooked onto that fear in that flight response, your body has to respond to that. So we cannot separate the two as being of two different categories. So if we take the appeasing child that's trying to keep drunk daddy kind of happy and not getting violent and hoping that then he's not going to lose his temper and hit mommy again type of thing, that appeasing belief system may play itself out through one's whole life, where whenever that now adult is in a position where they feel overpowered or threatened or unsafe, or someone's raising their voice, they may feel that they need to appease, to please, to keep the person happy so that they can be safe. So this is how a belief pattern can play itself out through one's whole life. And suddenly once one is in a situation where one would like to make certain independent decisions, or take a business step or something like that, and suddenly all of those old belief systems will play out. And the minute that the nervous system goes back into that program, it will have both a mind and a body reaction to it. So when a fear comes out, you will have both the fear, the emotional, and the adrenaline and palpitations of the physiology. So really, the most important thing to realize is that any form of wounding, be it emotional or be it physical, has both a emotional mental component and a physiological component playing out at the same time, because there is, by the nature of it, a neurophysiological response that is happening in the system. So why is that important to us? You know, the important thing for us in this is that when we are faced with certain situations, like wanting to change something's not working for us, we have anxiety that we're struggling with, or we have a body response that our body's not sleeping properly, or we have digestive issues, or when we're looking at something like that, very frequently there is a nervous system dysregulation, that is, the system is not coming back into a homeostatic balance. And if that's not happening, it means really that you're hanging upside down in the roller coaster and it's not coming back down into regulation. And when you are looking at something like that, you have to address it both at the level of the mind and at the level of the body simultaneously. So at the level of the mind, we may be needing to look at fears. We may need to be looking at belief structures that are playing themselves out on an ongoing basis, like the child who believes that she has to keep everybody happy for her to be safe. Okay, even if kind of 30, 40, 50, 60 years down the line, it's a very dysfunctional space, they may not be able to make a different decision based on that very early programming of keeping everyone happy in the family. Or for instance, if it was a situation of being called stupid or being made to feel stupid or unimportant, or mommy's paying more attention to my baby brother or sister, and I believe that I am not as lovable as them or as good enough. Whether that is real or not real, whether the mother actually believes that in her actions or not, the child's belief system will play itself out through one's entire life until that is changed. So what happens is that invariably, if I'm in a situation where I'm doing a life coaching program and somebody wants to change jobs or whatever, we cannot grow, we cannot step up to the next if we don't believe that we're good enough, that we deserve it, that we're worthy of being better, having more. So those old belief systems, which come from wounding, they come from trauma. So ultimately, we're always dealing with our limitations, and our limitations ultimately come from our woundings, from that scar that's not moving enough in that situation. Suddenly I want to bend my elbow to feed myself, and the scar is pulling too much. It's not giving me that range. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to mobilize that scar. And what that's going to mean is that I'm going to have to challenge myself mentally, emotionally, and potentially physically, because when I get triggered into that, which is ultimately what happens, we get a trigger. So a trigger is when we have a heightened response to a situation. So someone will say something to us, do something, come too close to us, and we have a heightened reaction to that, possibly larger than what is needed in that situation. Very frequently, or possibly 99.9% of the time, that stems from wounding, that stems from trauma. And the only way that you start to overcome that is by actually looking at our woundings, or our traumas, or our limitations. And all these words are synonymous in a situation like this. And this makes, by understanding our limitations and our woundings in this framework, allows us to embrace healing. It allows us to embrace what type of therapeutic approach is needed for that. Okay. So if we're looking at the body, so, we were discussing we need to look at mind and body. So from the mind aspect, we're looking at the beliefs, we're looking at the emotions, we're looking at kind of the 1 and 1, does it equal 2? Okay, because sometimes we're in a situation where 1 and 1 equals 5. But that is an old story that we're replaying out either in every relationship or in every job, or however that looks. That's the mental emotional framework. When we're looking at the physiological side, and this is where I found my challenges, because I would have people coming asking me to help them with their body challenges and their physiology. And the first thing that I would encounter very frequently in the more chronic conditions. So in the normal day to day, if we do the pretty much the right thing, the problem goes away. It's not rigid, it's not scarred, it's not resistant to change. When we have a physiology that is more resistant to change, then ultimately what I found is that I was needing to challenge the extent to which the physiology wanted to shift. And if I wanted it to shift back, so let's say we wanted to regulate the system, calm the system down, it would have needed us to kind of take it a little bit into that resistance zone. And when that happens, generally we lift up the wounding of that space. So sometimes it can be just a physiological response that people would suddenly start to feel clammy on the bed, or they'd feel like, I don't know why my heart's racing, I'm suddenly scared, please don't touch me, and not understand what was happening physiologically. And very often there would be an emotional cascade that comes with it that was not understood. It's like, why is this happening to me? Why am I scared? Why am I so angry suddenly? Why did I cry all afternoon after a session? And it really is because there was a wounding that subconsciously was challenged. And in order for us to stretch, so exactly that scar or a tight muscle, if we want to stretch that a little bit, we're going to have to stretch it, okay? And that stretching could mean a variety of different things. It could mean a actual physical movement into a new range or a new space. But ultimately, it would often require a mental and emotional shift. That what happens physiologically is that you're meeting the nervous system space that it entered. So if it entered a fight or flight mode, generally you'd meet fight and flight, okay? But also you would get cellular imprints. So let's say that you were hijacked and someone grabbed your arm, and I went and just casually went, "Hi, how you doing?" You may have that imprint lifting up, a flashback potentially. Sometimes most people don't actually know. They're like, "Oh gosh, you gave me a fright," and I think, but that was heightened. That was a trigger. It was far more than what was necessary in the current situation, and those are the cues to hang on. There is a wounding here, and there's no judgment to that. So people are very, and we all are quite sensitive to kind of being labeled as traumatized. We are all traumatized. Trauma is our society. We live in a traumatized society. Things that we call normal, I don't think are very normal. They're actually quite traumatizing. And if you just look at our current COVID situation, it's a very traumatic social experience, mental, emotional, physical, social experience. And to think that any of us, whether we have experienced the death of a loved one, whether we have or haven't had COVID, whether we have or haven't been vaccinated, whether we have or haven't anything, we are playing out quite abnormal circumstances under the umbrella of normal, and those create a level of wounding. Okay, so it doesn't have to be these big things like us saying, that are directly affecting you. So trauma or woundings don't even have to be direct. It can be the witnessing of something or the experiencing of something outside of oneself. Okay, so but coming back to really looking at understanding how the mind and the body and the physiology reacts, it allows a greater opportunity to understand why certain things are happening. It allows, so in circumstances where there is a heightened response, by understanding what is happening to your body, and that is absolutely normal, that if there is a wounding, even though you might not physically see the wounding there, you may have IBS, and you may decide to see a physio for them, or a dietitian, or any medical person for that. And we touch the body potentially. Maybe I'll do an abdominal massage or a visceral mobilization, and all these emotions come forward, or fears or angers come forward. That for me is quite a normal response. But for a lot of people, that is abnormal. What's wrong with me? I want to make this go away. What are you doing? Why am I? And what happens is that it doesn't allow for the healing process to continue, because ultimately there may be a resistance to it. But really what's happening is that there's a whole lot of emotional experiences that are packed into that area. And the nervous system, now that it wants to come down and regulate itself, is saying, okay, I'm happy to regulate, but I need to know what to do with this. So where do I put these boxes? Where do I pack this? And that is ultimately, and sometimes it means that we just need a good cry to help the body release stuff that's trapped. We may just need to journal. We may need to go into looking at specific events or situations or themes in our lives. It may be very simple. It may be a good cry. It may be more extensive depending on the level of the wounding, depending on the rigidity of that scar. But it doesn't mean that it can't be healed. So ultimately, I always have worked in a integrated way of not discounting one or the other system. So when I was working purely in my physiotherapy role, I was not able to discount and push aside the emotional responses or the flashbacks or the triggers that were created in that. I had to be mindful of that because I could really destabilize someone by not. When you starting to move into that wounding, ultimately you need to be sensitive to what's happening in the other spaces. And if one goes too quickly into that, what happens is that the emotional overload becomes too intense and the person pulls back from the process of healing or integration because they can't cope emotionally. So they see it as being, let me back away from the physical in order to protect myself emotionally. And really there needs to just be a balance of that. And even if I'm not in a touch therapy space and I'm just working purely in a mental and emotional framework, invariably my clients will come back and say, I've had a lot of backache, or I've had headaches since our last session. And they are surprised. I'm not surprised because I understand that there is a physiological cascade associated with me trying to challenge their beliefs or think out the box or push them into trying new things or extending their beliefs. And I think what I'd love to almost just get across to you today is, don't see that as normal. Expect it and look for it. And what I can say to you, as we heal the one, we heal the other. And in so doing, you will start to see that as you want to grow, as you want to expand, as you want to heal, you will not only heal in that area of the body, you not only will resolve your IBS, but you will resolve your anxiety, you will have a different perspective on life, your relationships will improve, your job satisfaction will change, your irritability with your children will change. They're all interlinked and they almost cannot, in my experience and understanding, they cannot be separated. And I think this is where we're failing ourselves in really understanding almost the biology, the actual physicality and of trauma and our wounding. So the thing with it is that trauma filters into, or our woundings filter into every single aspect of our lives. Okay, whether it's woundings coming from in utero, where a mother is not embracing her pregnancy, feeling that she cannot cope, flooding her system by the nature of that mental and emotional cascade, flooding her system with neurotransmitters that are giving the baby in utero, the fetus, a feeling of overwhelm by the nature of it because it's swimming in a pool of adrenaline and cortisol. That already causes a nervous system dysregulation, but that is not something that when you're 40, 50, 60 is going to be anything that you're going to put on the table as a trauma or a wounding, because it is so subconscious, it's not even understood. But ultimately, when we start to look at it, all these things that happen to us in our childhood, and it doesn't have to be bad happenings. It's just life. Life happens. We happen when life happens. And so it keeps happening and it doesn't stop happening until we can actually start to come back into equilibrium. But how that looks becomes challenging because a lot of the stuff is not within our conscious framework. We don't come in and say, I have IBS, and it's related to my difficult relationship with my mother for all those years that I was growing up. It's not something that we think about, but suddenly when we start working with the abdomen, the anger towards the parent or the mother starts to surface, and so it goes. So when we are mindful of it, we will embrace those experiences. We can actually start to see that as a normal part of the healing process. Of there must be a dysregulation there. Dysregulation doesn't just happen. It's not just the system decides to go off kilter and stay off kilter. And if it's moving off kilter, why is it not just coming back again at the end of the day or at the end of a stressful period? So when we are sitting with more long-standing mental, emotional, physical challenges, they more often than not are a combination of things that are happening. And really I think the invitation here that we have is an invitation to look at things in a more integrative way of what's really happening here and why is this happening. Why am I emotional after a massage? Why do I feel so angry suddenly? And noticing how every time I have a sore back, I'm feeling these emotions that go with it. And whether it is whether there is an old wound that's happening or not, when we have a negative or a less than optimal physical experience, we are emotional by the nature of it. If we've hurt our back yesterday and we're struggling to get in another car and get, function through the day, there is a dysregulation that will happen by the nature of it. So if you can imagine when we're sitting with chronic conditions of lower back pain over a 10 or 15-year period or 5-year period or 2-year period, there has to be a compensation in other systems to actually learn how to cope with that. And healing in all capacities is about addressing and looking at all of that. Right. So when we are basically thinking of how does this look for me, I think what is important is to start to, so if you are listening to this, whether it's live or whether it's recorded, there is a reason why you have come into a discussion around trauma or the biology of trauma. There must have been something that said to you, oh, that's interesting, or I wonder what that has for me, or I relate to that. And I think what I invite you to do is to really have a look at yourself in the invitation to be here. What brought you to a discussion like this? Was it just from a space of helping another that has a history of trauma? Was it about looking at yourself? Was it about what were you looking for in that? And I'm happy to, maybe if you want to pop that into some of the questions, and we can look at that and really start to see where we need to be going, what your needs are in that, where has possibly the system failed you or your beliefs failed you. Where do we go with this way of thinking? But from my side, when I look at the effects of our woundings and our traumas, really what is happening here is that we don't recognize that a lot of our day-to-day challenges come from a pattern of old stuff, old things that need to be re-looked at. And like I said, whether it's us dealing with our children, we're dealing with not only our children, but we're dealing with our belief systems around what was created when we were children. And either we play it out in exactly the same way to the way we were raised, or we decide that that wasn't great and we do it exactly the opposite way. And all of that is wounding based, okay? And when we have certain limitations, we don't know what the potential of that is until we have gone into it. We don't know what movement that scar can have. We don't know how much we can move that joint until we get into that space of actually challenging the system, challenging our minds, challenging our emotions, challenging our physicality, and understanding that you're probably not going to deal with one in an isolated space. You're probably going to deal with all of it. But how do we really start dealing with trauma and looking at it? And I think, if anything, if I'd like you to take anything away from the space, is that I invite you to not have a resistance to looking at your wounds. So what I found is that in my experiences, the areas where we struggle to heal, both physically, mentally, or emotionally, is where there was a resistance to it, where there was I don't want to go there. I've dealt with that part of my life. I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to feel that. I don't understand why something's happening, and developing a kind of resistance. I want to deal with this chronic pain, but I don't want to look at my childhood. I don't want to discuss abuse. I don't want to look at how my marriage is currently, playing itself out as having a part to play in how my physiology is reacting. And sometimes they cannot be separated. If your system is having this fight and flight response on a daily basis because you are really hating work, and you're suffering from headaches, you're never going to solve your headaches if you're not regulating your system. And if there is something causing the dysregulation of your system, you're never going to fix that without it being addressed. And when it is a direct relationship, as in they're both happening now, it's easier to see that relationship. But when it is something where there is an old scar, and especially if we can't see the scar, as in physically see it, it's very difficult to start to understand how to work on that if we can't see it, okay? And this is where I think just being open to looking at the system as a whole, and understanding that they generally do not work in isolation. That already is the first step into a process of healing, whether that's mental, emotional, or physical, okay, especially with chronic things. Dysregulation, and I discussed this in the Understanding the Nervous System webinar that's there for you to have a listen to if you haven't listened to it. But a lot of our chronic conditions come from nervous system dysregulation. What causes nervous system dysregulation? Trauma, wounds, certain kind of, like there's a stuckness in the system that's not letting it come back into regulation. It's like we went on the roller coaster, we're hanging upside down in the loop, and we can't unhook and come back to regulation. The system heals itself. A body heals itself by the nature of design. So when we are not healing in the way that we feel we should be, or in a natural progression, there is some stuckness there. And what I'm saying to you is that if you're stuck in any kind of aspect, I invite you into not being resistant to looking at old stuff. And I think some of the time we're resistant to looking at old stuff because maybe we've looked at it and looked at it and looked at it, but maybe we've never really approached it in the right way. So I think this is where sometimes our psychology framework can fail us, because it's not really addressing the physicality of the imprint or the implant or the nervous system dysregulation. And so it's almost like there isn't a cellular release of the trauma. There isn't a nervous system regulation of the space. And if you then go into kind of, let's say, a yoga or a somatic, a body modality touch therapy, suddenly all of those emotional triggers come up again. Is because the talking alone, the mental alone, hasn't been able to almost integrate that framework into wholeness. So, but again, the invitation is to not have the resistance, to go to wherever you need to go to do that healing. But how does that healing look? And for me, and I do kind of work in that integrative and more holistic way, where I don't do the two separately. So in my life coaching approaches, I work both mind and body, and I have modalities for the mind and I have modalities for the body, but I don't necessarily separate them. I integrate them in, that's why I very frequently use TRE, which is tension and trauma release. And at times I may choose to go more into a body modality where we don't need to talk about everything. We don't need to always go back and rehash. Going back is about identifying new things, about having aha moments. But beyond that, we need the tools to let it go. And that let go is both mentally, in learning how to unhook mentally, quietening the mind mentally, and not kind of going on that hamster wheel continuously, but it's also about calming the nervous system down. So sometimes we have this upregulated nervous system that stimulates the mind to stay activated in those thought processes. Whereas if the body was actually just calmer, we wouldn't actually get onto the thought patterns in the first place. So the two need to be, a calm mind is a calm body, and a calm body feeds back into a calm mind. And looking at how that looks in a space of healing and well-being will be dependent on the person. But the important thing is to really have that understanding, and then also to have a toolkit that you can actually start to help yourself in those spaces, to see this is not about the 1 hour a week or 2 hours a week that you may spend with a kind of therapist or whether it's mind, body, it doesn't matter. It's about what happens all, the other 23 hours of that day and the other 6 days of that week. And I think this is where we don't have enough tools. We don't know how to extend that. And it's, but again, once that the resistances are to looking at the more integrative part of you is not there, you will start to be more open-minded and going, okay, I have actually a very dissociated way of going through my days. I'm not really connected. I'm not feeling all that much, or I'm feeling way too much. I'm actually too overloaded. I'm too busy. And in those cases, we need to address that. And that requires a toolkit. It requires commitment and dedication. And especially when we're dealing with childhood things that are patterned, we are operating from the same pattern for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And I think this is where people get demotivated. But what I can say to you is, if you click into the right treatment modality or the right way of thinking, the shifts actually happen quite quickly and readily, that it can be very motivating, even in old patterns. But what needs to happen is there needs to be a level of facilitation usually. So I don't advise you to, in deeper woundings and deeper traumas, to think that this is something that can and should be done alone. So in the more indigenous cultures, when they look at things around healing, they have a belief that it's the tribe or the community's responsibility to heal, because it's almost like the community brings all their joint, almost medicine into the healing process. But really, from a neurophysiological aspect, we speak of co-regulation. So we, by the nature of our reptilian nature, we co-regulate our nervous systems with other people. So this becomes critical just in a day-to-day. So when we look at children, their nervous system will adjust to the nervous system of the parents or the caregivers by the nature of survival, okay, because the systems tag. And that can be to the positive and the negative side. So when we're looking at healing, especially healing of deeper wounds where we feel very unsafe and we feel very dysregulated, we fundamentally need to come into a space where we can tag on to a regulated nervous system. So it's basically as if you're picking up a recipe book and you're trying to cook a new recipe. You may not even know what the ingredients are, and it may be that you need to go, next door and actually join your pantry cupboards and actually start to combine the ingredients. And this is where, if certain ingredients are not in the mix or there isn't an understanding of that, so if there's early childhood trauma, there may never be an understanding of safety, what that actually means. What does it mean for me to feel safe? And that is not something you can intellectually teach somebody. You cannot. There is no intellectual framework, and with most trauma things, there isn't. Like, this is an intellectual discussion, but this discussion is not going to heal you. It's trauma and wounding is not an intellectual thing. It's an integration thing. It's an experiential thing. It's a feeling thing. So you cannot feel safe until you feel safe. You cannot understand what safety is until you've had an experience of safety. And that's where co-regulation becomes important. And that's where being in a space where certain ingredients are in the mix that actually provide the foundations for healing to happen. But outside of that, there is a need to have a certain toolkit to actually support what's been happening, that you can continue to take yourself through those processes, and actually develop a level of independence. So anything from codependency to addiction, of any sort, whether it's food, whether it's busyness, whether it's productivity addiction, whether it's social media, all of that stems very frequently from wounding or needing attention or trying to escape from life, or there's generally a pattern that, and we can diet ourselves stupid until we understand what the go-to is. And that is going back to looking at our woundings and our patternings, and actually integrating that cellularly, that if the system is calm, it's not going to say, please give me some chips, give me some sweets, okay? You feel the calmness. There is no need to. And again, it's not as much a mental framework as it is an integrative and experiential framework. And invariably, when we are looking at these types of approaches, we need skills in how to look at those wounded aspects of ourselves. So what we need to be very careful of, both within ourselves when we are doing our own trauma healing work, as well as kind of, for me, in a supportive space. The most important thing is to really understand the depth of the vulnerability that comes with our wounds, okay? Be it a wounding of feeling inadequate or unloved, or be it a wound of sexual trauma, there is a deep, 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 deep level of vulnerability that comes when we are meeting that wound in us. And, you know, we often in our healing of our traumas, there is a hardness that needs to, come forward. So generally, wounded or traumatized people are very resilient and strong people in one aspect, because if they've survived, they've had to overcome. And those are the gifts of trauma. But at the same time, where that can be so beneficial in some areas of our lives, it can fail us completely in another. Because when we want to look at healing, those harder approaches don't work, because the depth of the vulnerability that arises in you when you meet that wound, that center is so jelly and gooey and soft and vulnerable that if you don't enter that space with a deeper sense of love, of compassion, of nurturing, of care, what happens is you just re-traumatize on an ongoing basis. And that is something that actually just compounds the wound. So if you keep ripping that scab off and re-wounding, that eventually leads to these very intense barriers that provide a lot of resistance and protection in actually coming into that place where the healing can happen. So we need to develop tools to actually meet of how we've got to learn how to meet those aspects of ourselves in the wounding. We need to know how to, when we get those feelings of that 5-year-old that was told that they, not worthy and not good enough, and what's wrong with them, there must be something wrong with them, that is a deep, for the adult 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old, that doesn't seem like a big thing. But for that 4, 5, 6-year-old, integrating life and their current experiences, that is profound. When a caregiver or someone that they love and look up to tells them that they're useless or stupid, there is such a depth of vulnerability that's present in that space that when we want to go into that space, if we don't know how to love that wounded aspect of ourselves, how to speak to it, how to nurture it, how to care for it, what to give it and what not to give it, it really sets us up for the cycle of continuous re-traumatization. And that becomes dangerous in a way, because every time we want to go back there, it's like, oh, no, not again. I'm not doing that again. And really it limits us ultimately from reaching our potential in all aspects, whether it's our resiliency in life, whether it's meeting our passions, our purposes, our creativity, meeting good health and well-being and vitality and energy. All of those are hinged on us actually having a well-regulated and balanced homeostasis in the system, which ultimately comes back to nervous system. So really, when we're looking at how that healing looks and how we do that, there are a couple of different ways, but we need to understand the nature of the beast. We need to understand that certain things may require some level of co-regulation, that we may need somebody to facilitate the process, but in the saying that, you need enough tools to be able to go away with knowing what to do with this when you leave the space, and to learn how to meet and how to meet and greet that wounded aspect and nurture her or him, and support them into that integration process, so that almost there can be a wholeness that comes back into the system, that one can then move forward in. So that kind of brings me to the end of what I had wanted to discuss in today's webinar. But what I'll do is I'll give you an opportunity to ask some questions. Just pop it into the Q&A, and we can have a look at if there are any questions coming forward. I may look at running a future webinar and actually meeting the inner child, or that younger version of ourselves, that wounded aspect of ourselves, because I found that is critical in actually being able to take the first step into a integration process. So it's almost like that wounded aspect like floats without actually, and every time we meet it challenges us again, and we need to almost learn how to have this, they call it a compassionate inquiry with that inner child, with that wounded aspect of ourselves, so that we can actually start to ask it what it needs, and be able to facilitate a healing process in the now as the adult self. Right, so I'm just going to have a sip of water, and then we'll go on to some questions. Right, so I have a question that I'd like a bit of elaboration on. So what if you have an ACE score of 6? So the ACE is the adverse childhood environment. So like they have various questionnaires on there was an extensive study looking at, and it really was the stepping stone into understanding the effects of our childhood and the effects of trauma. And it was a study called the ACE study, which is Adverse Childhood Environments. And really what the study did is, and maybe while I'm chatting, if this person could just maybe expand on what exactly they were needing from the question. But in the study, this ACE study, it really opened the door into understanding the effects of less than optimal childhood experiences in the adult, both mentally, emotionally, in behavioral stuff, in failure of relationships, in work unhappiness, in physiological, physical illness, chronic illness, addiction patterns, codependency, like a variety of things. And they really started to see that when you have a high ACE score, so like you have a lot of kind of typical childhood adverse conditions, that that they may be you may be more prone to certain experiences as you become an adult. And really the long and the short of it is that and kind of they've moved one step beyond the kind of ACE categorizing. So what this means is that they've extended the definition of adverse childhood environments, because it only included that kind of the real nitty gritties, that alcoholic parent, the abandonments, the sexual traumas, the molestations, that type of, it was more intense things. But they also found that just those subtle experiences of the child as they were growing up was almost not even included in that classification, which also has these powerful implications in our beliefs and in our well-being as functioning adults in society. But the long and the short of it is that the more adverse or the more woundings, basically, for the lack of a better word, the all-encompassing woundings we have, and as children or growing up, as children, they just have so much more impact, that the higher the wounding in our childhood, the more likely we are as adults to have mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, adverse patternings that may not serve us ultimately in how we wish to live our lives. And basically, if there are those woundings and those kind of consequences in the adult, really what it's inviting you into is a process of looking at healing it and how that looks, and to move into a process like that, because the likelihood of having consequences mentally, emotionally, physically are very high. That's basically what a high A score is saying in any situation. So just expanding on that, I'd like to just share so the adverse childhood environments that the person posing the question alluded to was things like a drunken father, a nomad lifestyle. So I understand that as moving around a lot, severe operations on the abdomen, so raped, a drink spiked, and really, so what that is saying is that, firstly, from a drunken father aspect, it could come up with a variety of different ways in which that child needed to cope. So was this a situation of safety, which is usually, so the system can't really relax, even when it's at home, when it wants to sleep. Our cave is generally the space where our nervous system should come down. We eat, we sleep, we pee, we poo. This is the type of parasympathetic, the calm nervous system, and we digest food. So that's what happens in our calm nervous system. Suddenly, when home is not safe, when the child's ultimate safe space is tampered with, or there is a volatile person in the space, there is ultimately a lack of safety. So the system will move into a fight, flight, appeasing or freeze state to cope. It has to. So that is not a dysfunction, the fact that the system did that. What is the problem is that the system may still be doing that even as an adult, okay? A nomad lifestyle, moving around a lot, generally for children, doesn't allow them to solidify a sense of safety and stability. And it never, again, also allows the nervous system to relax. And when we're looking at, I'm not really, so I'm also reading into that and elaborating. So, even if, I'm just painting the picture generally, but it is interesting for me that the operations have been abdominal, because our abdominal space is the area that really needs a calm nervous system to function optimally. But generally, hospitalization, ill health, operations are traumatic by the nature of what they are. But here you've also got a actual physical wounding, okay? Rape is by the nature of it, a deep trauma. And really what has come forward is the person saying that they can't soothe themselves, which, how can they? How can you actually think that you would be able to? Because really, if that was not taught to that 2-year-old or 3-year-old or 5-year-old at the time when they were feeling unsafe, basically that was never learned. So it's almost like you're baking this cake, but you never realized, no one ever told you that you need to put baking powder or self-raising flour into the mix for it to rise. So there's almost this inability, and that's where co-regulation, that is about actually being able to be in a space where that can be taught and learned. And soothing and comforting and relaxation and nervous system regulation is really what soothing is a fundamental and primal safety need. It's you have to be able to do that in order to heal, in order to have an immune system that functions well, in order to have proper cell regeneration, rejuvenation, in order to connect, in order to be creative, in order to be curious. Otherwise, the system constantly goes, I'm not safe, I'm not safe, there's a lion that's going to eat me. And really what happens is that the actual brain neurophysiology changes. So in children, we see stressful situations, stressful home situations, trauma spaces, adverse childhood environments to be causing learning problems or ADHD type of issues at times, because the nervous system can't relax, firstly. So they're very edgy, they're fidgety, they're in a fight and flight response continuously. But also what's happening is the brain is wiring in a way that is saying that curiosity, contemplation, mental expandedness is not a priority. Fight and flight, survival is a priority. And everything from your hearing, your sight, your sensory processing, your memory, all of it changes based on the neurophysiology when we're under threat. So this is where we have learning disabilities or difficulty. So in the adult, it might be, I can't retain information. I don't know where I put my keys half the time. There's a memory issue. But and Alzheimer's, ironically, is actually a chronic inflammatory condition. So a long-standing nervous system dysregulation can result in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, which we've never understood properly in the past. But all these inflammatory conditions like diabetes, asthmas, our autoimmune conditions, arthritic conditions, our Parkinson's, our Alzheimer's, and there's just, the list goes on and on and on. All of those are inflammatory conditions. Our inability or the heightened, and COVID deaths are related to high inflammation. So if the system is already full of inflammation, cancer is another inflammatory condition. All of those are nervous system dysregulations, that the system is not able to control that inflammation by the nature of how much adrenaline and cortisol is continuously being pumped without reprieve. So, and this is how we can start to look at why it is so important for us, if we want to expand on any level, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, we want to really come back into looking at our woundings. And our deepest woundings are really from when we were little, because the implant is there, and because we don't know how, and that was the experience we've had, we don't know what safety looks like. So invariably what happens, we choose partners where we're not safe. We choose experiences that ultimately are not safe. We choose friends that betray us because we can't assess that. Almost trauma becomes your life, and it's normalized. So why would you think that shouting and beatings at home are not normal? Because that has been your normal, and generally the brain won't cue to those, like they won't pick them up as easily because it's been normalized. So there's a whole host of kind of entry points into why one would want to look at that. And then, and there's stuff coming out now around COVID saying that the post-COVID symptoms are actually very much related to trauma, and how much trauma. So people who have had very traumatic lives are finding COVID to be triggering trauma. And we are in a trauma space, so we're going to probably find ourselves challenged without skill sets and toolkits to help ourselves and those around us, our children, our parents, in actually living a more balanced and healthy life. Right. I don't have any other questions. Is there anyone that would like to say anything else? Otherwise, I'm going to leave things at this for today, and we can pick up at another time. So thank you for your time. I thank you for your questions and your input, and we'll chat again at another time. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.